So we are now going to share my screen and we're going to go over the changes to the purchase agreement. So the first thing I want to tell you is that the philosophical changes on the purchase agreement are going to be where we need to start. So if you've been working in this market for the last year and a half, 2 years, you know that we've been trying to cram our standard contract into a new scenario, which is an as is with inspections style of contract. So for the last year and a half, we've been writing contracts saying, seller, just let us have your house, please. And seller, you don't have to do anything, but we would like to have an inspection just to protect ourselves. And we're not even going to be bold enough to ask for a termination right unless material defects discovered during the course of inspections total more than X dollars. So that is what we would call an as is with inspections contract, meaning we're not expecting anything from the seller. We are not expecting the seller to make any repairs or be obligated to any repairs or any expense. But if there is what I'm calling a catastrophic discovery, then the buyer can terminate the contract. Now, we certainly have also seen ones where it's just as is, just a straight as is contract. Those are scarier to me for the buyer than the as is with inspections. So if we're lucky, we were at least getting as is with inspections. Now, the problem with that is that the standard contract we have been working with is not meant to work with as is with inspections language. If you're checking the box that the contract is contingent upon inspections, it obligates you to use an inspection addendum. And the inspection addendum details the inspections that will be taking place, but also has items in there meaning stating that the seller will respond to a repair request, that the buyer has to give a repair request. All of that creates conflicting language with what the expectations are or what everyone is trying to do. So we ended up, if you're a broker in town, you ended up having to work your way through some muddy situations where it's as is with inspections, but now the buyers are saying, oh, but we didn't know XYZ was wrong with the house. So now we're asking for repairs, even though everyone's expectation at the beginning was that the seller wouldn't be obligated to repairs. Now the buyer's asking for them because you can't put the cat back in the bag, right? They now know that the roof has 3 layers and is leaking around the chimney. Well, then you've got to pick a path then at that point. Are you going repairs? Are you not going repairs? And oftentimes a fight was ensuing. So the attempt by the Standard Forms Committee was to create a product that could be used in most markets, not just a seller's market, not just a buyer's market, but would give some options up front to the buyer and the seller, and would also alleviate the need to try to shoehorn as is with inspections into a purchase agreement that was never written to be that way. We are a buyer beware state. So you're never going to see a true due diligence contract out of the Standard Forms Committee. Not that we wouldn't all love to have a due diligence contract where it's, 10 days, buyer, satisfy yourself, you want to buy the house. And then after that 10 days, if the buyer hasn't terminated, that's it, we go to closing. The problem with that is that there are other Virginia statutes that conflict with that. So yes, you could have waived all the inspection contingencies at the conclusion of that due diligence period. But if the POA packet or the HOA packet hasn't been delivered yet, the buyer has a termination right, just a blanket terminate for any reason right. So it kind of cuts the seller off at the knees there if the buyer then can terminate 3 days prior to closing because the HOA packet finally got delivered through no fault of the seller or the listing agent. So a true due diligence contract is going to be difficult at best. So this is a hybrid of due diligence and still knowing that there are other termination rights in relation to the contract. So what they've done is they've said, let's get rid of the inspection addendum entirely. Let's bring the inspection contingencies or the inspection language back onto the body of the purchase agreement. So what you have now is the buyer and the seller are going to choose upfront, prior to ratification, as part of the original negotiations, what will the path through inspections look like? And there are now two options. One option is the way we've always been doing it, which is the buyer will have inspections and then they will ask for repairs and then the seller will respond. And I believe that the way it is written in here, they have actually, well, they've attempted to fix some of the snags that would come up in that path. There's now a very clear termination right if renegotiations are not successful during the repair request phase. So that's great. We don't end up stalemating and for weeks on end, we're fighting over items on the repair request on the ROC, okay? So that's path one. Same way we've been doing it. Buyer has the inspections, buyer submits a repair request, and there is going to be a definition in here about what would qualify to be a material defect. Just like we have on ours now, we're going to define what are allowable request items, because it's still not going to be that you can request cosmetic issues, matters of preference, grandfathered items, things that were built to code at the time but are not to code now. Those are still going to be off the table because they should be off the table. If you don't like the paint color in the living room, you know, that should not become something that helps you leverage some sort of negotiations with the seller. So that's path one. You can have your inspections as a buyer, submit your repair request, and then the seller has time to respond. And there is a second negotiation period there where we're negotiating the repairs. Option two, the other option is going to be if the seller and the buyer agree, and this is what I really want you to understand. This is not being forced onto sellers. If the buyer and the seller agree prior to ratification during the original negotiation period to allow the buyer to have a termination right associated with the inspections, then the buyer can have X numbers of days to have their inspections. And at any point during that inspection period, the buyer may terminate for any reason, as long as they can provide proof that they paid for an inspection. Now, it's written proof that they paid for an inspection. So I'm going to interpret that as a receipt from a home inspector, a receipt from a radon inspector. And if you can provide, as the buyer's agent, proof that an inspection was paid for, it does not mean you are not, the buyer's agent is not going to immediately send the report anymore, because we don't want to, on our way out the door, create problems for the seller. Maybe or maybe not, there's a crack in the foundation that could or could not be structural in nature. It's not going to burden the buyer on bringing in a structural engineer to verify that, but you also don't want to drop a home inspection report on the seller on your way out that says, hey, this may or may not be a structural issue, see you later, bye. And then the seller now has to hire a structural engineer to figure out whether it is or is not structural in nature. Not to mention the listing agent now having maybe a disclosure obligation. I would argue you don't really know if it's structural or not. So there really isn't a disclosure obligation until you know that it is structural in nature. So the buyer during the inspection timeline has a termination right up until that inspection deadline to terminate for any reason, so long as they have paid for an inspection and provided the receipt or written proof that they have paid for an inspection to the listing agent. And they are not obligated or even asked to supply the report associated with why they are terminating unless the listing agent asks for it. So this is going to give the buyer a glimpse at the house. They're going to get to go in, have inspections. They're going to be able to decide whether they still want to move forward with the offer or not, with the contract or not. And if they don't, they can terminate. Now, if they pass that inspection deadline and have not opted to terminate, then they enter the ROC, removal of contingency, repair request phase. Okay. So now that I've told you the philosophical differences, let's look at what it looks like on paper. And I promise I'm going to come back and we're going to have a million questions as well. So let's go ahead and look here on the sample document. This is going to be rolling out and be made available next month. So in just like 3 weeks. So this is going to give you time to get familiar with it. As we go down through here, everything's still looking pretty much the same. We're going to get through the money page, as I call it. And now we're going to get down here to clause 14, which is inspections and resolution of inspection issues. So I'm going to get on my paper copy here. And what this says, not that I'm in the habit of having circle time and reading out loud to y'all, but I do think it's important to go through this line by line. So if you can bear with me, I want to just read through it and then I'll interpret it for you in a way that I think I will be teaching it to my buyers. So as I'm sitting with my buyers or my sellers, this is how I'm going to explain it to them. I'm not going to read it word for word to my client, but I will interpret it for them and summarize it for them. So let me read through it first to you, and then we're going to summarize that. So it says, purchaser's obligations under this contract are or are not contingent on purchaser obtaining one or more inspections of the property, which may include, but is not limited to, inspections for or of the following: foundations, roofs, flooring, HVAC and electrical systems, plumbing, appliances, exterior insulation, drainage, structural issues, well, wood destroying organisms, environmental or radon. But it doesn't have to be exclusively those items, because this is now going to move the inspection jurisdiction, if you will, to the four corners of the property. Now, on our current contract, we write in things that we want to include that are not part of the primary dwelling. I am going to currently, on our current contract, I'm going to write in a detached storage shed. I'm going to write in an in-ground swimming pool and all of its components. On this new version, we're going to write out things. So as the listing agent, if I know there's a tree in the backyard with a big split in it, and I've said to them, hey, there's a tree in the backyard with a big split in it, or hey, there's a crack in the in-ground pool, the pool is conveying as is. If I've said that in my MLS private remarks, if I've said that the in-ground pool is conveying as is, I am going to make sure as the listing agent that is included in the language on the actual purchase agreement. Otherwise, it could come into the purview of the removal of contingency form. Okay. Obviously, the buyer still has a right to inspect it, because we're not going to keep buyers from inspecting things. But if I want it to be as is, I'm going to write it in here. And if I want something within the four corners of the property to convey in as is condition, I'm going to write that in. We're only going to figure out how this is used in the market after we begin using it in the market. And we will see what additional terms people have started to write in. So let's keep moving here. It goes on to say, all such inspections will be conducted at purchaser's sole cost and expense unless otherwise required by lender, and will be conducted by engineers, inspectors, contractors. I'm sorry, the big sample word is right over top of that. Contractors who will be licensed in their discipline by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, the reason why it says unless required by the lender is there are some government-backed loans that require the seller to pay for the termite inspection. So we didn't want to create a problem there. Standard Forms Committee wanted to at least have a nod to that if the lender requires the inspection to be done by the seller, then it has to be done by the seller as a condition of the loan. But otherwise, purchasers are now responsible for any and all inspection fees. The purchaser is going to order all of the inspections on the property. It goes on to say, if purchaser's inspections reveal the need for additional inspections as recommended by the engineer, inspector, or contractor, purchaser will notify seller in writing prior to the inspection deadline, and the inspection deadline will be extended no more than 7 business days to conduct such additional inspections. That is the same language we have in the inspection addendum currently. So if the home inspector comes out on the last day of the inspection timeline and says, ugh, I don't know about XYZ, you should have an HVAC specialist, a structural engineer, an electrician come out and really dig deeper into that. Then you've got to have an extension to your inspection deadline. And this lays out how you do that as the buyer's agent. If purchaser fails either to conduct the inspections in the time specified or to provide the materials as set out in paragraph 14B below by the inspection deadline, or as it may have been extended, the right to conduct such additional inspections will be deemed waived by purchaser. So if you waste your time, you do not have your inspections, you do not call for an extension, then the buyer waives their right to have that inspection. Everything must be completed prior to the inspection deadline. If you're getting too close to the inspection deadline, you need to ask for an extension and get everyone to sign off on an extension, unless it's an extension for subsequent inspections. If it's an extension for subsequent inspections, you just simply have to give notice in writing via email that you are executing your right to extend the inspection deadline. If it's not for a subsequent inspection, if it's for an original inspection, you're going to need to secure an extension on your inspection deadline. Okay, moving on to the tail end of this paragraph. Purchaser will be liable for any damage caused as a result of the actions of purchaser or its engineers, inspectors, or contractors on the property in connection with this paragraph. Such obligation will survive earlier termination of this contract as to any damage on the property. The reports for the inspections will be collectively referred to as the inspection reports, and each individually as an inspection report. So if the yard gets torn up for the septic inspector to do an inspection of the distribution box, it will be the purchaser's responsibility to put that back the way they found it. Okay. Now, in the event the property is served by a septic system, purchaser's obligations under this contract are or are not contingent on purchaser obtaining a septic inspection. And if purchaser elects a septic inspection, the following provision will apply. Purchaser will obtain a septic inspection by a licensed or accredited inspector, on-site sewage system operator, on-site sewage system installer, or on-site soil evaluator, commonly now called as septic inspector, at purchaser's sole expense within the inspection deadline. The seller will remove any landscaping, personal property, or improvement that impedes the septic inspection. Purchaser will be liable for any damage to the property caused as a result of the septic inspection. In the event the contract is terminated, such obligation will survive termination as to any damage on the property. The reports for the inspections will be collectively referred to as the inspection reports, and each individually as an inspection report. And then you have to indicate what type of septic inspection will you be doing, because the seller needs to know if you are going to dig up the entire distribution box and run camera lines down all of what is that word called, Jennifer? The lines, the septic lines. So the septic inspection will consist of and check all that apply. You are now giving notice as the buyer's agent to the seller up front as to how invasive of a septic inspection you will be doing. And because septic could be costly, septic inspections could be costly and could potentially tear up somebody's yard, it's important to notify and agree up front as to what that's going to look like. The seller may say, no way, you are not tearing up my yard. You are not going to tear up my yard and take a look at the distribution box. And if you are not going to run camera lines down the drain field, whatever it is, the seller is or is not going to agree to, they are at least doing it before we're ratified. Okay, this is not going to be a fight 2 weeks later. It's going to be up front. Okay, we're going to push on and we're going to go through resolution of inspection issues, okay? No later than the end of the inspection deadline or as it may have been extended, purchaser will deliver to seller, listing agent, and selling agent a complete copy of each inspection report, including septic inspection, if applicable, dealing with a requested repair. So this is if we're asking for repairs. Together with a repair addendum to the contract, setting forth purchasers' requested repairs, now called the repair addendum. We will now have an additional form called repair addendum rather than a removal of contingency form. It looks very similar. Purchaser acknowledges the repair addendum shall not include cosmetic items or matters of preference, grandfathered features or systems that are properly functioning, but which would not comply with current building codes if installed or constructed today, and features or systems that are properly functioning, but near, at, or beyond their normal useful life. If purchaser makes timely delivery of the repair addendum and copies of all required inspection reports, then the parties will have blank business days, and if blank, it is 3 days, 3 business days after purchaser's delivery to negotiate a mutually agreeable repair addendum. Okay, so we are going to now say how many days we're going to be able to go back and forth on this repair addendum. We're going to submit it, and seller and buyer are going to have X business days. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm probably going to put 5 business days in there, because I like to have a contractor come out and estimate the expense of the repairs for my seller prior to my seller making a decision as to whether they are going to or not going to make the repairs. Okay, so it's 3 business days if left blank, but y'all know I don't like blanks. So put something in there, even if you're putting 3 in there. I am likely going to be putting 5 business days. And then it goes on to say, during negotiations of such repair addendum, the parties may make, alter, extend, or withdraw offers and counteroffers as they each believe appropriate in an effort to reach agreement. Rejection by one party of an offer by another will not of itself terminate the negotiation process, meaning we can go back and forth 50 times within this negotiation period saying, I will do this, I won't do that, I will do this, I won't do that. And you can't, there is no termination right until that deadline, until an agreement is made and everyone's signed on it, or this negotiation period expires. So now there's no more of that fear. You know, I got a removal of contingency form returned to me from a listing agent yesterday. We could not find a heating vent in one of the bedrooms. So we had asked that an HVAC specialist come in and install a ductwork and a heat vent into this bedroom. Well, they struck that from the removal of contingency form and included a photo of the bed being moved. It was a very large bed. They had moved the bed and taken a photo of the heat vent. Well, I could have had a toehold then to terminate the contract because they did not agree to my list of repairs the way I sent it. I don't know that I would have been successful or not, but it would have given me a bargaining chip there. So that should not be the way it is. There should not be easy access to termination rights like that. So in this case, now there's no more fear to go back and say, hey, turns out there is a heating vent. Sorry you didn't find it. Here's a photo of it. And we're going to take that off of this repair addendum. And yes, we'll agree to everything else. So now there's no fear on either side to negotiate, because it should be a negotiation period. So now we're going to negotiate for X business days. And then it goes on to say, the parties will continue the process of negotiation until either the parties mutually agree on and execute the repair addendum, setting out the agreed resolution, or the parties cannot agree on the repair addendum. If no agreement is reached by the end of the negotiation period, and this is important, purchaser will have 2 business days thereafter to terminate this contract. Failure of purchaser to terminate within such time will constitute purchaser's acceptance of the property, and the contingencies related to inspections will be deemed satisfied, waived, and removed. and this contract will remain in full force and effect. In the event this contract is terminated, the parties will enter into a mutual release and the deposit will be refunded in full to purchaser in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 11A above. So you must negotiate until the negotiation period has expired. And at that point, either the buyer is going to terminate or you guys are going to move forward to closing. Okay, at least there's a finite end to that now. Now, let's move to C. This is that path 2 I was talking about. That is purchaser option. Purchaser option says this paragraph is or is not applicable. If no box is checked, the paragraph is not applicable. If this paragraph is applicable and purchaser is dissatisfied with their inspection results of the property, then in lieu of submitting a repair addendum to the seller, purchaser may instead terminate this contract by written notice to seller prior to the inspection deadline or as it may have been extended, including written evidence of inspections performed, provided, however, if purchaser submits a repair addendum to the seller, then purchaser waives their right to terminate this contract pursuant to this paragraph and agrees to proceed with the negotiation of the repair addendum as set forth above. Meaning, the buyer cannot say, okay, cool, I'm going to submit a repair addendum, but if I don't like their response, I'm going to go ahead and exercise my termination right here with section C. Because you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't eat your cake and have it too. Instead, you're picking one of the two paths. If both are applicable, you're going to pick one of the two paths. You're either going to early terminate with clause C, or you're going to submit a repair addendum in clause B and ask to negotiate the repairs. Okay. The last bit here is if purchaser terminates this contract in accordance with this paragraph, the deposit will be refunded in full to the purchaser in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 11A above. Upon request by seller, purchaser will provide entire copies of any inspection reports. Now we're almost to the question and answer period, I promise. D goes on to say that if purchaser fails to make timely delivery of repair addendum or termination prior to the inspection deadline or as it may have been extended, then the contingencies related to inspections will be deemed satisfied, waived, and removed, and this contract will remain in full force and effect. Meaning if the buyer just sits on this, goes on a cruise for 10 days, does nothing, submits nothing, then the buyer has waived inspection contingencies and will be expected to move forward to closing. Okay. 15 is inflow and infiltration inspection, because that is a required inspection by Western Virginia Water Authority. And really, the seller and the buyer can decide that they're not going to have it. However, the new buyer is going to get a love note from the Western Virginia Water Authority after the fact, after closing. So they're going to go ahead and make this outside of the inspection process, because inflow and infiltration inspection is burdened on the seller by Western Virginia Water Authority. So it is a standalone clause now. And it goes on to say that you're going to have X business days after ratification to request the inflow and infiltration inspection. We have no control over when they will actually come out and do that inspection. And if there are issues, it says that the seller will remedy at the seller's expense. But if the seller refuses to remedy it, the purchaser has a termination right. Okay. It doesn't get into up to X dollars or anything like that. It's seller will decide when we get the report whether they are or are not going to remedy an inflow and infiltration inspection flaw. And if they do, if the home is not in conformance, then the seller will say, yes, I'll fix it. No, I won't. And then the buyer has a termination right if the seller is not going to fix it. Okay. I want to stop here. There are some other changes down through here. I won't say they're massive changes because we've changed how this process works. We've had to tweak some of the additional language about sellers and purchasers options. But I think it's more important to get to the questions right now about everything else. But one last piece I want to touch on is clause 17. Clause 17 is the seller's and purchaser's options. We have that currently, except now clause 17 is just going to give a repair remediation limit for the seller, but it's only going to pertain to title. And paragraph 16, which basically is a tree falls on the house from inspections until closing. What we would consider walkthrough or pre-settlement or pre-occupancy issues. So it's going to be title and anything that happens from the time you go under contract until closing to the house that wasn't there before, okay? So the remediation limit only pertains to title and something that happens to the property from the time you go under contract until you go to closing, okay? Just a small tweak to that. Because now you see there is no upper limit for repairs that you can request of a seller. But the seller can just say, nope, I'm not doing that. I'll do this and that. And then the buyer can say whether that works for them or not. So let me stop sharing my screen, or maybe I'll leave the screen up, but let me unmute you guys, or you unmute yourself, and let's move on to some questions and answers.